Hello. Today we will be discussing a historical figure and the historically unique eras in Chapter 10. This will be presented by myself, Noeli Topete, Ramon Hernandez, and Kaitlyn Lee. I am Mishima Yukio. I am one of Japan's most famous novelists. I also wrote plays about Madame de Sade and Adolf Hitler, and even starred in a gangster movie. In 1968, I was seriously considered as a candidate for the Nobel Prize for Literature, but lost to my colleague, Kawabata Yasunari. It was rumored that the reasoning for my loss was because I was a younger man and I would have another shot at it later. My novels were of post-war Japan in the point of view of the generation reared during the 15 Years' War, who were assured firstly of imperial victory, but then exhorted to die gloriously in the defense of the emperor. Then suddenly told that it was all a lie and the samurai mindset was an aberration. The common themes of my novels were the decline of the Japanese spirit. I wrote of the great men and virtuous women of the Meiji era who were supplanted by irresponsible and irresolute weaklings tainted by unwelcome foreign influences. On November 25, 1970, I went to the Ichigaya barracks with my 4 young cadets. There I met General Mashida Kanetoshi, who greeted me and my cadets. General Mashida Kanetoshi noticed I was carrying a samurai sword and asked if the police really let me walk around with it. I explained to him that the samurai blade was made by a famous smith. I then asked my assistant for a handkerchief, as if I was going to give the blade a quick wipe and show it to the general so that he could examine the artistry of the manufacture for himself. This was actually a signal, and my men of the Shield Society grabbed, then bound and gagged him, then jammed his office door shut with pile furniture. After these events, I issued my demand that the general should order his soldiers to assemble outside beneath the balcony so that I could address them on an important matter, and if he were to refuse, I would kill myself. True to samurai custom, the soldiers ignored their general's orders, mounting 2 rescue attempts before they obeyed and assembled beneath the office to hear what I had to say. I stepped onto the balcony at noon, half an hour later than expected, wearing a headband embroidered with the motto of the Japanese hero, 7 lives for the fatherland. I began to give my speech about the state of modern Japan, a Japan that was drunk on prosperity and falling into moral emptiness. I asked the soldiers where the real spirit of the samurai had gone, the spirit that was in the soldiers of the 1930s who were committed to purifying Japan. I argued that it surely lay with them, the self-defense force. They still contained a coil military might, a sense of justice, the power to seize control and drag Japan back onto a course of righteousness, but only if the soldiers below me had the will. I had a 30-minute speech prepared, but the soldiers were not listening and began to call me an idiot. I cut my speech after 7 minutes of speaking and bellowed below to the soldiers something about the spirit of the samurai and how it was time to rise up and die. And I ended with a banzai salute wishing 10,000 years to the emperor and went inside. Inside, I knelt to the floor and stabbed myself in the stomach, dragging my dagger across my abdomen from right to left, and grabbed a nearby brush to write my final message in my blood. It was then my associate Morita turned to deliver my final blow and sever my head with a sword. After a few failed attempts, Furu Koga, a better swordsman, took over and delivered the final blow. Morita then kneeled to take his turn.
Corporations played a big role in Chapter 10. The Korean War helped them pick up their economy as well as invest for the future. It put the Japanese in a prime position to supply the U.S. during the Korean War. It actually accounted for 27% of manufacturing export revenue for the country. Another thing that helped them out was the Tokyo Olympics, which attracted more tourism, which also helped them invest in infrastructure to serve employees and new tourism. They piggyback off that to also help big business around, leading into the Kairetsu, the integrated systems. Just like the old Zaibatsu were broken off, they started to kind of reunite, just because not necessarily because they were plotting or anything, but it just helped a common goal, their interest. So much of their structure, name was just aligned that it made sense for them. And by doing this, profits became larger, companies also became bigger. Other sectors started seeing the success that they were having. Car manufacturing was one of the big ones at first. They started jumping into other ones such as toys, gaming, electronics. Leading into the town of Toys was the first successful export for the post-war period for Japan. It became so big that 44 warehouses pooled all their warehousing and manufacturing resources to make a district of toy manufacturing. This is how big it was. As you guys can see, Transformers was one of their most successful toys out there. They were constantly forced to innovate due to China's cheap labor and building of toys. So what they did to counteract this was they started building more sophisticated toys, such as the Transformer, which was two toys in one practically. Next, leading into another thing that was big in this chapter was salarymen. Usually, I guess you can account for, usually a salaryman would be a male white collar worker that was employed by a government or big business corporation. It wouldn't necessarily be a person that just had a salary. There were some exclusions to that. But some of the traditions that salarymen had was they worked up to 80 hours a week, lifetime employment, often forced to retire. Embittered seniors who were forced out of the top officials due to not being able to have enough positions for older employees to take. Necessarily couldn't quit because social status would plummet. They were seen as bottom of the food chain if a person was quit, didn't, or couldn't handle the pressure of a salaryman. So they had a lot of pressure. A lot of the corporations hired a whole class up to 400 employees at a time, and there wasn't too many spots to go up to top management. So they were either forced to take lower positions later on in age and retire.
In order to recover from the economic strains of the war, Japan emphasized hard work. With that, the salarymen became a recognizable symbol of the Japanese economy. However, 48% of their workforce was female, and their working conditions were overlooked. Working Japanese women were reduced to a second-class sector of the workforce, divided into three groups. There were the office ladies. These were typically women in their early 20s doing secretarial work, and who would eventually get married and leave. Then there were the older women, working part-time in factory assembly, food preparation, and other unglamorous jobs. Finally, there were the pink-collar sector of nursing and childcare. Women's salaries were lower than their male counterparts. Working women rarely had childcare, since the structure of Japan's workforce was built on the assumption that motherhood was the responsibility and vocation of every woman. Wives held the domestic purse strings, that is to say that the husbands earned the money, but the wife controlled the spending. Many women happily left the workforce for marriage, on the assumption that their marriage was stable and that their husband had a lucrative job. She could expect to have packed her kids off to high school by her late 30s. Then she would become the center of a new sector of leisure. Wives could take advantage of their empty nest while their husband was at work. Women indulged in a variety of hobbies and pastimes. In the 1980s, another female consumption bloc gained influence. The office ladies were banking on marriage and retirement before 25, while they lived rent-free with their parents. Their few working years were considered disposable income. These parasite singles became the target market for cosmetics and fashion, branded goods and foreign vacations, and contributed to the widespread popularity of cute goods. Brands like Sanrio's Hello Kitty were intended for schoolgirls, but extended these women's younger days into adulthood. Some women refused tradition by resisting to go along with semi-arranged marriages that had previously been the default means of matchmaking. In 1945, 69% of Japanese marriages were arranged by omiai, or meet and greet.
This number has steadily fallen to 6.2% due to the Western influence of dating and personal choice. Other Japanese simply refuse to get married at all, or they do so much later. In the Meiji era, girls tended to marry at 16. This average marrying age for women rose to 23 by the 1950s and is about 29.3 today. Consequently, this has reduced the size of families in Japan. The increase in only children and greater awareness of women's rights encouraged some women to resist the pressure to degrade themselves to walking wives and instead make better long-term choices in regards to their education and career. This female empowerment has even led to social movements for women's rights. In 2019, the Coup 2 movement started a petition to outlaw mandatory high heels as part of the professional dress code for Japanese women. This movement is just one of the ways that Japanese women show their strength and perseverance against continued gender discrimination.